in his endorsement. And for all book lovers, and I'm sure all you good people are, this is a great document that we have only because Jefferson kept it in his papers with a line drawn through it. But this is where he says, he's talking about the fact that the British have burned the Library of Congress, and so he sold them his library, which was actually, from the perspective of scholarship, it was fantastic that the British burned the library, because then Jefferson sold them his library and overnight transformed the Library of Congress into a major research library instead of a small politically oriented collection. But Jefferson says on two different occasions what this meant for him. His famous statement to John Adams is, "I cannot live without books," which you can find in the gift shop and mugs and things. But he said it a different way here, and he says it to Morey because he's originally planning to ask Morey to buy him a bunch of these books he needs to have to start replacing his library. And he says, "I must now buy again, for books are the best medicine for the ennui of age." But he goes on, and to any book lover, the best part is toward the end, where he says, he describes what kind of books he likes. He says, "I like much better the octavo volume than any other size, because without being too heavy for the hand, it is large enough to open on the table according to convenience. You may accordingly observe octavo called for in the catalog wherever there are good editions of that size. I like good bindings and handsome without being over elegant for use." So when you look at the books he bought, that's exactly right. If you can get a much bigger one, he doesn't want it because he wants to be able to read it. So then, you know, for the next decade or so, Jefferson is getting an annual letter from Morey and not writing back. In fact, he never writes them back after 1815. And at first you would think, well, that's cold. But as I say, he was hearing from him in other ways. It's hard for him to send letters. But I'll end with two further letters. One is a letter after he dies from Morey to James Madison in 1828. And that's the fifth of your 6 pages. And Morey says to Madison, "You may conceive what my feelings were on our privation of this ancient friend at Monticello. We were classmates more than 70 years ago, and from that time to his finally leaving us, I have invariably experienced his steady friendship. I was the youngest of the class, and indeed used to think that he was partial to me." So that's kind of endearing, but also, well, he used to think he was partial to me. But then we find that in last letter, a draft of a letter in March 1826, Jefferson is asked by Thomas W. Morey, Morey asks him to pass on, Morey asks Jefferson to pass on how he is doing to James Morey. So through that intermediary of Thomas W. Morey, Jefferson replies. And this is 3 months before Jefferson dies. And Jefferson says, "In your kind office of intermediate between us, I pray you to assure him, James Morey, that I retain for him still all my schoolboy affections, and that his prosperity and happiness are very dear to me. My own health is much broken, and my faculties so much impaired by age, as to prepare me to meet with welcome the hour which shall once more reassemble our ancient class with its venerable head, his father, Reverend Morey." And so, even though if it wasn't a letter directly to him, he's very much in Jefferson's mind, even in his last days. So I thought I should end with Jefferson's words, because that's always a good way to end. But I'm happy to welcome you here. I'm thrilled about your gift. You see some of the connections with what's in that to what Morey and Jefferson are writing about, and I'm happy to take questions.
About 10 minutes for questions, and there's a microphone for 2 people to step up and ask Jeff anything.
In the years after Jefferson returned to Monticello, How many hours a day do you think he spent writing letters? I think it's a lot.
Well, it was a lot. I don't know that we can put a number on it, but I do know that his daily routine involved getting up and dealing with his writing desk until he was done, and then he would go out on his morning to early afternoon ride. So I think it was probably 2 or 3 hours a day, most days. He complains bitterly about it to John Adams and others, but especially to John Adams. He says, you know, people keep writing me letters. It's driving me crazy. People I don't know write me letters, and you have to kind of write a courteous reply. And at one point he says, you know, is this life, having to spend hours at the writing table? Compared to this, the life of a cabbage is paradise. And so what Jefferson and Adams, what he does is he persuades Adams to issue a kind of a joint letter that says, please leave us alone. The problem that they have is that Jefferson and Adams did not receive, back then there was no presidential pension. So nobody got a pension until right up to like Harry Truman. But Jefferson and Adams, unlike the others, did get one little tiny pension in the form of a perk voted them by Congress, and that was free postage. And back then, that actually meant free postage in both directions. So you could write a letter to Jefferson, and they would write free on it in the post office. It would come to him. What that meant was that anybody with a piece of paper could send Jefferson a letter. And some of our most interesting and sometimes colorful letters are written by sometimes actual cranks. Jefferson will sometimes turn a letter over and endorse it insane on the back. As well as people that are hitting him up for loans, not knowing that this is not going to happen. But yeah, that definitely means that Jefferson was spending a lot of time, even writing letters, even though he did not respond to the ones he marked insane, but he was writing a lot of letters. We estimate that in his life, Jefferson wrote at least 18,000 letters. And of course, he's writing them all in his own handwriting, no typewriters, and he seldom used secretaries.
Was it common for him to save his drafts? Have you found lots of drafts, like there was the draft to the Maury letter?
It's a good question, and the answer is he didn't save his drafts when he had a working copier. You know, you'll see on your tour his polygraph, the machine with 2 pens. And before that, he used the letterpress, which was a kind of a similar idea, different technology. It would take tissue paper while the ink was still wet. You'd apply the tissue paper and pressure, and that would create a copy he would keep. Jefferson wanted what amounted to a Xerox copy of every letter he wrote because he didn't trust a copyist, both because he didn't trust him to be accurate and because he didn't necessarily want them to know what he was writing. We think one of the things we think we've learned is that Jefferson probably always created a draft, but when he had the letterpress or copying machine working, then he probably discarded the draft. And we think that because whenever the polygraph isn't working, we tend to have a draft, and the drafts we have tend to be heavily marked up. And so it's the theory that makes sense is that Jefferson wrote these heavily marked up drafts all the time, but he didn't keep them when he had a better copy available. And I used to think when I started working on Jefferson that I would get all these letters with the beautiful 4-page letter with just 2 or 3 words changed here and there, and I thought, this guy's like Mozart, you know, he just writes it, and it's right from the moment it leaves his pen. And then we get to the period when the polygraph isn't working, they're all heavily marked up. And so either that was the moment when he suddenly started having to mark them up heavily, or much more likely, there were drafts before. And if so, I think Jefferson probably took some pleasure in eliminating the evidence that he had to work so hard, but he couldn't do that anymore when he had the polygraph not working. And so I think he always had to labor over those letters, which is a great comfort to the rest of us. It didn't come that easily, even to Jefferson.
I had a question on who appointed James consul to Liverpool, and how long was he there? I know I should know this, so I apologize to my cousins, but, and how long was he in Liverpool as consul?
Well, there are probably half a dozen people here who know this better than I do, but I can tell you that he's appointed by George Washington. He's appointed by George Washington in the 1790s, and he holds that office until he dies. And okay, tell me.
He is appointed in 1790 by George Washington, who was in the first class of consuls, and because he was the only person already in residence, he is largely regarded as the first acting consul of the United States, because he's the only one who didn't have to travel to his post. He usually is said to have served between 1790 and 1829. It's not entirely accurate. He served 1790 to 1812 and 1815 to 1829 because we filed diplomatic relations during War of 1812. He passed away in New York.
Can you use the microphone?
Yes, I'm
So to sum up what Megan was just saying, I was forgetting the villain of the piece, and that's Andrew Jackson, because we start the spoils system, and he kicks him out in 1829. So he's appointed in 1790, one of the first class of consuls, and they're first to start serving because he's already there, so he doesn't have to go there to start being the consul. So it's 1790 to 1829, except that he can't very well be consul when we don't have relations between 1812 and 1815. And so I tried, and I was right about who appointed him. After that, I needed help from because as you see, what I know is 1809 to 1826. And it's a little bit dicey after that. Thank you, Megan.
Hi, I'm one of the Morris. I was wondering, in the letters in the period that you're looking at, what comments